A settlement is a place with a permanent human population. The first agricultural settlements appeared around 12,000 years ago. Before that, people survived by hunting and gathering, so they lived in temporary or movable shelters. The first permanent settlements were small enough that the inhabitants could all farm and subsist on the surrounding fields. Over time, in several places around the world, small agricultural settlements began to develop characteristics that made them the first true urban settlements, or cities. These characteristics included the presence of an agricultural surplus, the rise of social stratification and a leadership class or urban elite, and the beginning of job specialization. A surplus of food became available as irrigation, farming, and domestication of animals and plants developed. These changes enabled increasing numbers of people to live in the same location. A ruling class emerged to control the products that were accumulating and the people living in the community. Because not everyone was needed to produce food, some people could specialize in making things, such as tools, weapons, or art. Others specialized as accountants or religious leaders, the first members of a service sector. The process of developing towns and cities is known as urbanization, an ongoing process that does not end once a city is formed. Urbanization also involves the causes of and effects on existing cities that are growing ever larger. Describing a region as urbanized indicates that cities are present there. Urbanization is one of the most important phenomena of the 19th and 20th centuries, and geographers continue to study its development through the 21st century. Today, more than 50% of the world's population lives in cities, and demographers estimate that by the year 2030, 60% will live in cities. Most of these people will be in less developed countries of the world's periphery and semi-periphery. While urbanization can be positive for both individuals and societies, the challenges can be overwhelming if cities are not prepared to grow or urbanization occurs too rapidly. A suburb is a largely residential area adjacent to an urban area. Suburbanization involves the process of people moving, usually from cities, to residential areas on the outskirts of cities. There they form communities that are connected to the city for jobs and services. However, they're often less densely populated and less ethnically diverse than cities. Several causes contributed to the growing suburbanization in North America after World War II. Among these were economic expansion, greater purchasing power for many families, the growth of a car-centered lifestyle, and the government's construction of a vast system of new highways, which allowed workers to commute from their city jobs to suburban homes. In the United States, the Federal Housing Administration provided mortgage loans for families to move to the suburbs, which were newly zoned for single-family housing. Racial tensions provided another impetus for suburban growth. As African Americans came to the North in search of jobs and better education, many white Americans moved to the suburbs and what became known as white flight. Government investment in continued suburban growth, along with a lack of investment in inner cities, hastened both urban decline and suburban growth. Industries and jobs left the cities, and residents followed them. In addition, highways were sometimes built in locations that uprooted or divided existing urban communities. The most prosperous of the earliest agricultural settlements grew into urban centers shortly after the Neolithic Revolution, about 10,000 BC, as human groups began to grow crops and domesticate animals. The most successful of these settlements became the world's first city-states. City-states consisted of an urban center, the city, and its surrounding territory and agricultural villages. A city-state had its own political system and functioned independently from other city-states. The population in surrounding villages and territory received services and protection from the urban center. Because of the wealth of these communities, they were often raided by other groups. As a result, defense was a primary consideration, and military leaders evolved into political rulers known as kings. Early city-states emerged in several locations around the globe in urban hearths, areas generally associated with river valleys in which seasonal floods and fertile soils aided in the production of agricultural surplus. City-states eventually coalesced to form early states and empires. As cities grew, more people developed specialized skills other than producing food. This changed the relationship between cities and the areas around them. City residents depended on farmers for food. In return, people in cities focused on supplying services for their inhabitants and the inhabitants of surrounding regions. Early cities often specialized in particular services. Some emerged as administrative centers from which the elite ruled. Others, often associated with important shrines, became religious centers. Defensive strongholds, university towns, and centers of specialized production located at resource sites also emerged. Most definitions of a city describe a place in which there is a relative concentration of people. Cities are places where people come together and build a nucleated or clustered settlement. The easiest way to define a city is legally. A city is the territory inside officially recognized boundaries. This definition is useful for determining the precise population, for taxing residents, and for establishing and enforcing governing rules. Most large cities today, as defined legally, share boundaries with adjacent cities, yet those boundaries are visible only on a map. On the ground, a person leaving one city might have no idea they were entering a new legal city. A collection of adjacent cities across which population density is high and continuous is known as a metropolitan area, sometimes called a metro area. Most large cities in the world today are really metro areas of a series of legally defined cities, but they're referred to using only the name of the largest city. For example, the metro area of Denver, Colorado consists of the cities of Denver, Aurora, Lakewood, Englewood, Greenwood Village, and other neighboring legally defined cities. Megacities are the world's largest and typically have more than 10 million people. These urban giants often exert an influence that is felt regionally and sometimes worldwide. This influence is due to the size of their population, but in other cases their influence is derived as much from their political, economic, and cultural power. Megacities were once found only at the centers of large empires or the most powerful countries. However, that pattern has changed today. In the past century, a combination of high birth rates and rural to urban migration in less developed countries has made megacities more common in these countries than in the developed world. Of the 30 largest metropolitan areas in the world in 2015, about half were in semi-periphery or periphery countries. Megacities in relatively poor countries face the same challenges as megacities in wealthy countries, but without as many resources to respond. Social problems between ethnic groups, joblessness, lack of infrastructure, inadequate housing, and environmental problems, such as Mexico City's severe air pollution, are common in these megacities. Megacities such as New York, London, Tokyo, and Paris are world cities, or global cities, ones that exert influence far beyond their national boundaries. All are currently media hubs and financial centers with influential stock exchanges, banks, and corporate headquarters. Many are the headquarters of international organizations. For example, New York is home to the United Nations. Some geographers also include cities that are powerful in a particular region as world cities. These include Dubai in the Middle East, Singapore in Southeast Asia, Shanghai in East Asia, and Sydney in the South Pacific. The term megalopolis goes back to the early 1900s and describes a chain of connected cities. It became more common after 1961 when French geographer Jean Gottman used it to describe the continuously developed string of cities from Boston through New York and Philadelphia all the way to Baltimore and Washington, D.C. The Baz-Wash corridor now includes nearly 50 million residents. These cities had grown until they formed a single conurbation. They had essentially merged into a single, uninterrupted urban area. The cities crossed state boundaries and exceeded the definition of a metropolitan area, which is focused on a single urban center. Gottman noted that although legally the major cities remained separate, they and their suburbs had become a single region that had taken on some characteristics of a single massive city. Since that time, with urban growth occurring across the planet, other cities have combined into megalopolises. The corridor in California, from San Diego through Los Angeles to San Francisco, is a single growing metropolitan corridor on the west coast of the United States. Tokyo, Yokohama is a megalopolis in Japan.